Module C of our Six Sigma day speaks to the measure phase of our process. It is one of the longer modules, and I was going to say the most important. It certainly is an important step in the DMAIC process, but I don't want to emphasize one over another. They're all important, and hopefully you'll get a better understanding as to why the measure phase is an important step in the next several slides. So what we're going to do in the measure phase is take the information that we've been provided from our management team and our team so far through the define process, and we want to establish some baselines. We want to validate our data and information that we're getting from the process. So basically everyone at the end of our measure stage is going to agree that this is where we're starting and these are the inputs that we have to our process. We haven't necessarily validated which ones are the most important yet, but we are looking at the data that we have. We'll analyze it a little bit later, but right now what we're trying to do is understand the baselines as to where we are in our process, what are all those variables, and again, this is our starting point. When I describe a Kaizen event, I always will mention to people, if I am talking to someone on my cell phone and they're trying to give me directions to get to their location, the first question they're going to ask me is, where are you? And that's basically what we're trying to determine in the measure phase of our project. Where are we? What does our existing process look like? So when we're done and we have a process map, everyone's going to agree that this is where we are. So there's a lot of different things that we can measure in our process, and we need to establish what those metrics are. Some of them have already been established by our management group, but there may be some other ones that, as we start collecting data and information, that we're going to deem important as well. So again, what does our process look like? Where are we? How many defects, how many errors are we making? How are we quantifying where we are right now?
When I was growing up in Louisiana.
So identifying these key measurables, one of the places that we can look is actually downstream and talking to our customer. Our customer is not always an external customer. Sometimes that customer is the next department or several departments down the process from us. So understanding what their requirements are, what's important to them, would provide us with additional measurables that we will have during our measure phase. As we begin to collect our data, it's important that we're collecting the right information. We need to agree on the definitions, and we don't want to be measuring part of the process. I'll give you an example. One of the projects that I worked on was an order acknowledgement process, and I believe at the time it was taking approximately 3 weeks to acknowledge an order back to a customer, which you would think is just an incredibly long period of time, and actually it is. But in this particular case, there were some times where the customer would request items within the quoted lead time, and this particular operation, this organization, would need to verify that they could get parts and have production time available to meet those requirements. Call them new requirements. So prior to acknowledging, they had to do a lot of different things to validate that they were able to in fact meet the original quotation with these revised requirements. So it was about 15 days. And what we soon realized as we were starting to walk through the process and develop our baseline materials is that those 15 days weren't realistic. The acknowledgement would come in from the customer. It would be with a sales engineer. They would maybe review it for a day or two before it actually got to a administrative assistant who would log it in. That login was the date of receipt, and often it was several days beyond the actual date of the receipt. So we weren't capturing the entire process. Lastly, when the acknowledgement went out to the customer, there was actually a delay when it was logged out from that same administrative assistant to the sales engineer, and then the sales engineer had a couple other steps in the process that they would do before it was formally sent out. So in reality, what we thought was a 3-week process that was long was actually closer to 4, and sometimes, I think our baseline was just over 4 weeks. I think it was 4 weeks and 1 day was the actual baseline that we'd established with about 6 months worth of data. So be really careful that what you're measuring is accurate. There's a lot of measurement variation out there, and we want to make sure that we have the most accurate baselines to make our enhancements from. So gathering the data, understand this with your team. Sometimes there's already data that is available. Question it, question where it's coming from. How is it collected? Is there any information or any jobs that are not being included in that? We want to make sure that it's totally representative of the process that we're trying to enhance. So always question your data, understand completely where it's coming from, and if you do have to put some measurements in place to start collecting data, it might be nice to let people know that you're only going to do that for a certain amount of time as you collect baseline data. The last thing we want to do is start introducing non-value added processes into our operations. So if you are going to collect some data, let people know that you're only going to do it for a short period of time while the project's running, or just to collect some baseline data, and then once that's done, you're going to pull it out of there. And then please, be truthful to your word and do pull it out of there, because again, data collection is non-value added unless we're using it for some sort of enhancement activity. Some ways to collect the data: you can use some sort of check sheet or log. Probably some of the most popular ones in that format. There's other ones that can be done probably automatically, just using some existing systems. So if you've got areas that are tracking product through a particular department or reports through a particular area, there's generally the first place that I want to look is in systems like that, where I can pull off some automatic data and not have to do any additional data entry. One of our 8 different types of waste and inefficiencies we know is duplication or overproducing, and we overproduce data all the time. So the opportunity here is to try to avoid checklists if possible and work with existing data. If you are going to need to collect some additional data, consider maybe adding another column or two to an existing check sheet or form, and then again eliminating that after you've completed your project, or after you've deemed that the data is no longer valuable to collect. Run charts are pretty popular, and this is actually going to be a nice visual representation of how we are doing within our process. So to establish some baseline information, in this particular example, we may have a tally sheet that each operator has, and at the end of the day, we ask that operator to just plot how many lost calls they've had on that given day. Now, this 25 lost calls may be a cumulative of 3 or 4 people, or just may be individuals. It's whatever you've defined, but simply something very simple can be used. Run charts are really nice because this provides a nice visual representation of what our process is yielding for us, and then later on we can go off and analyze this data. If we are looking at process capability and we can measure our process to determine what defects we have, we're going to be able to do that. Generally, I'm going to tell you that you're going to need a green belt or black belt to assist you with this to determine what that process capability is. But basically, you have a process that has some sort of variation represented by this bell curve. The areas in red are outside the lower and upper specification limits. So we're going to want to quantify how many defects we're actually making. This can be in a percent defective. This can be represented as a CPK value, or some other number. So we're not just looking for times or number of drop calls, but also defect rates, yields, things of that nature as well. In addition to identifying the actual baselines of our processes, another baseline that we should consider is a level zero or process map that defines our inputs and our outputs at each step within our operation. So again, relative to our project, here's two examples, a manufacturing and non-manufacturing example. What are the inputs that are important at these steps? What are those outputs? And to define that. So creating a level zero or a little bit more detailed process map would also be included in the measure phase, because what we're trying to, again, identify are what are all those inputs to our process? What are the important outputs to our process? What are those process steps looking like? So where are we? What does my process look like? Create a process map as well. A C&E matrix is something that we're going to be able to start and identify. All I want you folks to know, since we go through this in much greater detail in the Greenbelt module, is that we're going to take those inputs from our process step, our previous process steps, and evaluate them relative to our outputs. So you have two columns here, which is the process step and the inputs. That would have come from our process map. The outputs are also from our process map. And basically what we're doing here is we're seeing if there's a correlation between that input and the output. And if there is, we're going to put a higher number, like a 9 there. If it's not, we're going to put a lower number. Just nice that you know that a C&E matrix exists. This is not going to be on the test in any way, but just if you do run across it and your team starts to work on it, you at least have a little bit of an exposure to it. Okay. Later on, we're going to rank those and sort the different steps in the inputs, and you can see there's a total column here on the right. As we filter that, the larger numbers come to the top, the lower numbers go to the bottom. So the inputs that have very little effect on our outputs are going to show up at the bottom, and we're going to be more concerned about those higher number inputs, the ones that have the greater effect. Those are our significant few. We take those significant few, maybe the top 3 or 4 folks or inputs, I should say, from our C&E matrix, and we're going to put them into a failure modes effects analysis. And that's our FMEA tool. Much like the C&E matrix, we cover this in higher level belt training, but at least you have a little bit of an input or a little bit of an idea as to what it's going to look like. This is part of the document, and basically what we're doing is we're taking that step and that input from that C&E matrix, and we're trying to drill down a little bit more, and we're trying to look at those inputs relative to severity of what could occur if that went wrong, the probability of it occurring, of those causes, and what controls do we actually have in place? How well are those controls detected? They're going to roll together into this RPN number, which is a risk priority number. And again, this is something that's covered at higher level belt training. But if you do see this, and if you are part of a team that's going to work on this, a higher level belt, a green belt or black belt, will walk you through this, but you'll at least have a little bit of an idea as to what an FMEA is. Much like the C&E matrix, we're going to rank them, and we're going to identify some of the risks associated within our process. And the ones with the greater RPN numbers are the ones that we're going to want to go off and work on and look at controlling them to reduce our risk associated with them. So here is a level 0 process map. It's another term for this is a SIPOC, which is Supplier, Input, Process, Output, Customer. That's the acronym. I've also heard it described by a gentleman as a COPUS, and he was taught that things start with a customer. So he learned the acronym the other way, which is Customer, Output, Process, Input, and Supplier. Regardless of how you remember the acronym and the tool, what we're trying to do here is identify what our process is, what are those inputs, and what are those outputs within that process, who are the suppliers, and who are our customers. Okay, so we're trying to document what's happening within our process. You can look back a few slides for our manufacturing and non-manufacturing example. And what I'd like you to do now is attempt to create this SIPOC using your process that you're looking at improving. Just develop a very low level process map.